A new start. The golden morning sunlight bathed the quiet suburb of Elmwood Hills, casting a warm glow over its manicured lawns and tree-lined streets. The place looked as though it had been plucked straight from a glossy postcard. It was Ayanna Taylor's first day in the community, and she was eager to take it all in. Elmwood Hills was nothing like the bustling urban chaos she had just left behind. The air was cleaner, the streets calmer, and everything seemed wrapped in a blanket of serene order. Ayanna parked her modest rental car in front of a small park tucked between rows of pristine colonial-style houses. She stepped out, stretching slightly after the long drive, her crisp white shirt and well-fitted jeans reflecting her relaxed but professional demeanor. As a career police officer who had recently been promoted to captain, Ayanna had seen her fair share of chaos and corruption. She had worked tirelessly to climb the ranks, and now she was ready for the challenge of leading a new precinct. This town, Elmwood Hills, was supposed to be her fresh start. As she adjusted her satchel over her shoulder, Ayanna took a deep breath. The scent of freshly cut grass mixed with the faint aroma of flowers from nearby gardens. She allowed herself a rare smile. "So far, so good," she murmured. She decided to take a leisurely walk to get a feel for the area before officially reporting to the station. Her sneakers crunched softly on the pavement as she strolled past rows of immaculate homes. Each house looked like a magazine cover, symmetrical windows, perfectly trimmed hedges, and driveways gleaming with luxury cars. She nodded politely to a few passers-by, receiving polite but cautious smiles in return. It wasn't surprising. Elmwood Hills had a reputation for exclusivity. Most residents had lived there for decades, and newcomers often drew curious eyes. Still, Ayanna was determined to integrate herself. She reminded herself that change took time and patience. As she walked, Ayanna noticed a group of teenagers lounging near a park bench. Their boisterous laughter echoed across the otherwise quiet street. One of the boys had his skateboard perched on the edge of the bench, while another was tossing a basketball lazily between his hands. They glanced at her briefly, then resumed their conversation, seemingly uninterested. Ayanna smiled faintly to herself. Teenagers were the same everywhere, full of energy, testing boundaries, but largely harmless. Further down the street, she passed an elderly man trimming roses in his front yard. His hunched figure and deliberate movements reminded her of her grandfather. "Those roses are beautiful," Ayanna called out, her voice warm and genuine. The man straightened slowly, squinting at her before offering a small, cautious smile. "Thank you. Just planted them last month. They're lovely," she said, feeling a small spark of connection. As Ayanna continued her walk, she noticed the way the residents interacted, or didn't interact, with her. Politeness was there, but it lacked warmth. She couldn't tell if it was because she was a new face or because of something else entirely. Her years in law enforcement had honed her instincts, and something about the atmosphere felt off. It wasn't hostility, exactly, but there was a layer of tension beneath the surface. She rounded a corner and paused at the sight of a large oak tree in the middle of a park. It was a quiet spot, inviting and serene, and Ayanna decided to sit for a moment. As she sat on a bench beneath the sprawling branches, she pulled out her phone to check her email. Among the unread messages were several from the precinct staff, filled with reports and updates she needed to review. Her new role as captain came with a mountain of responsibilities, but Ayanna welcomed the challenge. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car engine. She looked up to see a patrol car cruising slowly down the street. Her mind shifted automatically into work mode, analyzing the situation. The officer behind the wheel was a white man in his mid-40s with sharp, angular features and a rigid posture. His patrol car came to a stop a few yards away from her, and he stepped out, adjusting his utility belt. The officer's name tag read Russell. Officer Dave Russell was a fixture in Elmwood Hills. He had worked the beat for over a decade and took immense pride in protecting the community. To him, Elmwood Hills was a sanctuary, a safe haven from the chaos of the outside world. He believed it was his duty to keep it that way, even if it meant being overly suspicious of anyone who didn't fit his idea of who belonged. As he approached Ayanna, his sharp eyes took her in with a quick, judgmental sweep. Casual jeans, sneakers, and a confident posture. Yet she wasn't a face he recognized. Something about her presence unsettled him. "Morning," Dave said curtly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was used to being obeyed. "Can I help you with something?" Ayanna looked up, meeting his gaze evenly. "No, thank you. I'm just out for a walk." Dave's eyes narrowed slightly. "You new around here?" "I am," Ayanna replied calmly, sensing the suspicion in his tone. Dave crossed his arms, his stance shifting into one of subtle intimidation. "Mind if I ask what you're doing in this neighborhood?" Ayanna raised an eyebrow, keeping her tone neutral. "I live here now." "Is that so?" Dave's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Mind showing me some ID?" Ayanna's jaw tightened. She had faced situations like this before. Subtle power plays disguised as routine inquiries. "I didn't think walking in a park required identification," she said, her tone firm but polite. Dave's expression hardened. "Just following protocol, ma'am. We don't get many strangers around here." Ayanna felt the weight of his words. She could see the assumptions forming behind his guarded eyes. Still, she kept her voice steady. "I'm not a stranger. I'm the new captain of the Elmwood Hills precinct." For a moment, Dave blinked, his brain struggling to process her words. Then, as if to double down on his authority, he said, "Funny. I haven't heard anything about a new captain." Ayanna stood, her posture straight and commanding. "Well, you have now." The tension between them was palpable, but Ayanna refused to back down. She could see the uncertainty flicker across Dave's face, but he quickly masked it with a dismissive scoff. "We'll see about that," he muttered, reaching for his radio. As he called in to verify her claim, Ayanna stood silently, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Dave's escalating hostility. Residents from nearby houses began peering out of their windows, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding scene. Unbeknownst to Officer Russell, this encounter was about to change everything. For him, for Ayanna, and for the community they both served. A clash of perspectives. Dave Russell stood by his patrol car, radio in hand, his face tight with determination. Ayanna watched him with a calm yet steady gaze, her stance resolute. The crisp morning air had grown tense, charged with the weight of assumptions and unspoken biases. Residents peeked from behind curtains and hedges, their expressions ranging from curiosity to apprehension. The quiet street seemed to hold its breath. Dave spoke into his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Russell. Need a verification on a new captain assigned to the Elmwood Hills precinct. Got a situation here." The voice crackled back, calm and professional. "Stand by, Officer Russell. Checking personnel records now." Ayanna stood still, her hands loosely at her sides. She could feel the weight of Dave's suspicion, the way his gaze darted over her as if trying to find flaws in her story. She wasn't surprised by his reaction. Over the years, she had encountered countless officers like him. Those who wore their biases as comfortably as their uniforms. "I'm going to need you to stay put until this is sorted out," Dave said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ayanna didn't flinch. "I'm not going anywhere, officer." Her composed response only seemed to irritate him further. He was used to people either cowering or growing defensive in these situations. Ayanna did neither. Her calm confidence unnerved him, though he didn't show it. "You've got quite the attitude for someone who's under scrutiny," Dave remarked, his words laced with condescension. Ayanna's lips curved into a faint smile. "I'd call it composure, Officer Russell. Something I've had to develop over years of dealing with misunderstandings like this." Dave bristled. "Misunderstandings? I'm just doing my job. This is protocol." "Is it?" Ayanna's voice was steady, her gaze piercing. "Stopping someone who's done nothing but take a walk. Demanding ID without probable cause. That's an interesting interpretation of protocol." Before Dave could respond, his radio crackled again. "Officer Russell, verification confirmed. The new captain for Elmwood Hills Precinct is Captain Ayanna Taylor. She officially starts today." Dave froze, the words landing like a punch to his gut. For a moment, he didn't move, the realization dawning on him like a slow, unwelcome wave. He turned back toward Ayanna, his face flushed, a mixture of disbelief and embarrassment creeping into his expression. You're the captain." His voice was quieter now, almost disbelieving. "That's correct," Ayanna said, her tone neutral. "Is there anything else you'd like to check, Officer Russell?" Dave hesitated, struggling to reconcile the image he had formed of her with the truth. His mind raced, searching for a way to regain control of the situation. But no amount of authority could erase the mistake he had just made. He began, but Ayanna held up a hand. "Before you say anything, let me ask you something," she said, stepping closer. Her voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to her words. "What exactly about me made you so suspicious? Was it my jeans, my sneakers, or was it simply the fact that you didn't recognize my face?" Dave's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to push back, but the truth was uncomfortably clear, even to him. "I didn't mean. I've been a police officer for over a decade," Ayanna interrupted. "I've served in some of the toughest precincts, worked cases that would keep most people awake at night. And yet, on my very first day here, I'm treated like a criminal for doing nothing more than walking down the street." Dave looked away, his eyes darting toward the gathering crowd. The murmurs of the onlookers were growing louder, their unease palpable. This wasn't how he wanted to be seen, not as the officer who made a public scene based on his own biases. "Captain Taylor," he said finally, his voice stiff, "I apologize for the misunderstanding." Ayanna studied him for a long moment. Is that all this was? A misunderstanding? Dave's face darkened. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone who had just walked into his territory. "I'm trying to do my job, Captain." "And I'm trying to do mine," Ayanna replied. "But your job isn't to assume the worst about someone just because they don't look like they belong. Your job is to protect and serve all people, not just the ones you're comfortable with." The words hit harder than Dave expected. He prided himself on being a good officer, someone who upheld the law and kept his community safe. But in this moment, he couldn't deny that his actions had been driven more by instinct than reason. And that instinct was the moment Ayanna entered, heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence as officers and staff looked up from their desks. Ayanna felt their eyes on her, some curious, some surprised, and a few openly skeptical. She knew the look well. It was the look of a team sizing up their new leader. She straightened her shoulders, her posture exuding confidence. Her presence alone was enough to command attention. But Ayanna wasn't here to intimidate. She was here to lead, to show them what real leadership looked like. A tall man with salt and pepper hair approached her, his uniform crisp and his stride purposeful. His name tag read Lieutenant Harris. "Captain Taylor," he said, extending a hand. His tone was polite but measured, as though he were reserving judgment. "Welcome to Elmwood Hills." "Thank you, Lieutenant," Ayanna replied, shaking his hand firmly. "It's good to finally be here." Harris gestured toward the hallway leading to the captain's office. "Let me show you to your office. I've also arranged for a brief meeting with the team later this morning." As they walked, Ayanna took in the station. It was well organized and clean, a reflection of the town it served. But she also noticed the subtle signs of complacency, the way some officers leaned a little too comfortably in their chairs, the relaxed pace of those who weren't directly involved in pressing tasks. Elmwood Hills wasn't a precinct accustomed to high-stakes policing, and it showed. When they reached her office, Harris opened the door and stepped aside. The room was modest but functional, with a large desk, a row of filing cabinets, and a window that overlooked the street. A neatly stacked pile of folders sat on the desk, likely the files Harris thought she should prioritize. "I'll leave you to settle in," Harris said. If you need anything, let me know. Ayanna nodded. I will. Thank you, Lieutenant. Once the door closed, Ayanna took a moment to absorb her surroundings. She moved to the desk, running her fingers over its smooth surface before sitting down in the high-backed chair. She opened one of the folders, her eyes scanning the contents quickly. Crime in Elmwood Hills was minimal. Petty thefts, the occasional vandalism, and a few domestic disturbances. But Ayanna wasn't fooled by the numbers. A quiet precinct often hid deeper problems, ones that didn't show up in reports. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Come in, she called. The door opened to reveal a young officer, his face flushed with nervousness. Captain Taylor, ma'am. I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Officer Martinez. Ayanna smiled warmly, gesturing for him to step inside. Nice to meet you, Officer Martinez. What can I do for you? Martinez hesitated, glancing at the door before speaking. I just wanted to say, I'm glad you're here. This place, it needs someone like you. Ayanna tilted her head, studying him. Someone like me? He nodded quickly, his cheeks reddening. I mean someone who isn't afraid to shake things up. Things around here, they've been the same for a long time. And not always in a good way. Ayanna leaned forward slightly, her interest piqued. Go on. Martinez glanced at the door again, lowering his voice. Some of the officers here, they've gotten too comfortable. They treat this town like their own little kingdom. If you don't fit their mold, they'd make it hard for you. For residents, for officers like me. Ayanna's eyes narrowed. Officers like you. Martinez hesitated, then nodded. I'm not from around here. I transferred in from a different precinct last year. And I've seen things. Nothing outright illegal, but the way some of the senior officers handle things, it doesn't sit right with me. Especially Officer Russell. The name sent a flicker of recognition through Ayanna. Dave Russell. Martinez nodded again, his expression grim. He's been here a long time. People listen to him, and he knows it. But he picks and chooses who he wants to protect and serve. If you're not part of the right crowd, you're a problem. Ayanna leaned back in her chair, absorbing his words. Martinez's honesty was refreshing, but it also confirmed her suspicions. Elmwood Hills wasn't as perfect as it appeared. The problems here weren't just about crime. They were about the culture within the precinct itself. Thank you for telling me this, Martinez, Ayanna said finally. I'll need officers like you, those who aren't afraid to speak up, to help me make the changes this place needs. Martinez straightened, his nervousness giving way to a spark of determination. You can count on me, Captain. As he left the office, Ayanna sat back in her chair, her mind churning. She had known this assignment would be a challenge, but now the stakes felt even higher. Elmwood Hills wasn't just a test of her leadership. It was an opportunity to dismantle the subtle yet powerful systems of bias and complacency that had taken root. And she wasn't going to back down. The unseen battles. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork, introductions, and acclamation. Captain Ayanna Taylor, despite her calm exterior, could feel the undercurrent of tension in the precinct. The older officers, the ones who had been here long before her arrival, seemed wary of her leadership. There was a cold politeness in their interactions. Nothing overt, nothing that could be seen as insubordination, but a distance that told Ayanna everything she needed to know. They were waiting for her to make a mistake. But Ayanna wasn't easily intimidated. She had spent years earning the trust of her colleagues in other precincts, proving herself not just as a capable officer, but as a leader who commanded respect. And she knew that to earn respect here, she would have to do it differently. The morning of the third day in the precinct, Ayanna had an idea. She had read through the department's reports. Nothing extraordinary, no major crime waves or gang activities. But there was something about the way the cases were handled that caught her attention. The cases involving minor crimes often seemed to be left unresolved or filed away without much investigation. Petty thefts, vandalism, and disturbances seemed to go unnoticed in the grand scheme of things, but Ayanna knew all too well how these small, seemingly insignificant incidents could spiral out of control if ignored. She walked into the briefing room that morning with a purpose. The officers were gathered in their usual places, some leaning against the walls, others sitting slouched in chairs, all waiting for the morning briefing to begin. The mood was subdued, as it always was, and Ayanna knew she had to shake things up if she was going to get through to them. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice firm but approachable. "I've been going through some of the cases that have been reported over the past few months, and I've noticed something." The room fell silent. A few officers exchanged glances, and Ayanna could tell that her words had already piqued their interest. Many of the smaller crimes, petty thefts, vandalism, and even minor disturbances, seemed to be getting buried in the paperwork. Ayanna continued, walking slowly across the room. "And I don't believe that's good enough. Every crime, no matter how small, deserves attention. Every person in this community deserves to feel safe, even if the crime isn't headline news." Officer Harris, the lieutenant who had been cordial to her since her arrival, raised an eyebrow. "Captain, you want us to focus on the small stuff. I mean, sure, we can investigate a few broken windows, but we got bigger fish to fry, don't you think?" Ayanna met his gaze with a calm yet unwavering stare. "If we ignore the small things, Harris, they have a way of snowballing. A stolen bicycle here, a vandalized mailbox there. Before we know it, we got a larger issue on our hands. And that's when the real problems start." She could see some of the officers shifting in their seats. They were used to a certain routine in Elmwood Hills, a routine that didn't often involve much risk or controversy. But Ayanna wasn't here to play it safe. "I want every officer in this room to spend the next week personally checking into at least one unresolved case from the last month. No more filing it away for someone else to handle. We're going to clean up the streets from the ground up. And if you think it's a waste of time, then maybe it's time you start asking yourself what we're really here for." Her word tongue in the air, sharp and direct. Ayanna knew she wasn't going to win everyone over with a single speech, but the message had been delivered. Change was coming, and it wasn't going to be easy for anyone, least of all the officers who had grown complacent. Later that afternoon, Ayanna decided to take a walk through the town. She needed to connect with the community directly, to see firsthand what she was dealing with beyond the walls of the precinct. The streets of Elmwood Hills were quiet, the air still and warm. It was a picturesque town, the kind of place that felt like it should be on a postcard. But Ayanna knew better than to take appearances at face value. As she strolled down a tree-lined avenue, she passed a few people on their porches, enjoying the mild autumn afternoon. Most of them gave her the same polite but distant nod, the kind of greeting you offer someone you don't know well, but don't want to ignore either. Ayanna's mind was focused on the task ahead, but her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden shout. "Hey, you're the new captain, right?" She turned to see a young man jogging up to her. He was in his mid-20s, wearing a hoodie and jeans, his face friendly, but with an edge that suggested he didn't fit the mold of the typical Elmwood Hills resident. His name was Jamal, and he had lived in the town for years, but Ayanna had never seen him before. "That's right," Ayanna said with a polite smile. "Ayanna Taylor. How can I help you?" Jamal stopped in front of her, catching his breath. "I've got a few things I want to talk about. It's just, well, you know how it is around here. The police don't always listen to folks like me." Ayanna raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Jamal glanced around before leaning in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You ever hear about what happened with my cousin? They said he was involved in a robbery, but the story didn't add up. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But no one wanted to listen. They just assumed he was guilty because of where he lived." Ayanna felt a pang of understanding. She had seen it before, the assumptions made based on someone's appearance, their neighborhood, their background. It was a bias that festered within the system, and often went unchecked. "I'm sorry that happened," Ayanna said, her tone sincere. "What can I do to help?" Jamal hesitated but then pulled out a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "This is the case number. I've tried talking to officers about it, but nothing's been done. Can you look into it? I just want the truth to come out." Ayanna took the paper, her eyes scanning the details. It wasn't the kind of case that would make headlines, but it was the kind of case that Ayanna knew could reveal deeper issues within the community, issues of race, class, and the presumption of guilt based on appearance. "I'll look into it," she said firmly. "I promise." Jamal seemed relieved, his tense shoulders dropping slightly. "Thanks. Really, that's all we need. Someone to listen." Ayanna nodded. "I'll do more than listen. I'll act." As she walked back toward her car, Ayanna's thoughts swirled. This was just the beginning. The case Jamal had mentioned was likely the tip of the iceberg, a symptom of a much larger problem. It wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about changing the way people saw the law. The bias, the indifference, the complacency, it all had to go. She knew this would be a long road, and she was prepared for the battle. Every action, every step she took in this town was a fight not just for justice, but for understanding. It wasn't going to be easy. The officers she worked with, the community she served, they would resist, and she would be tested in ways she hadn't anticipated. But Ayanna was ready. She had faced down corruption, institutionalized racism, and systemic failures in her past assignments. Elmwood Hills would not be different. It would not break her. If anything, it would make her stronger. And she wasn't going to stop until she had transformed this place, one small change at a time. Unraveling threads. The days in Elmwood Hills had begun to blend together as Ayanna settled into her role, but something was different now. There was a growing sense of urgency in her every step. The quiet town that appeared so pristine on the surface was starting to reveal its fractures. It wasn't just the minor crimes being ignored or the underlying biases of some officers. It was something deeper, something more sinister, and Ayanna wasn't about to let it fester. After Jamal's visit, Ayanna had promised herself she would take a closer look at the case he'd mentioned. But as the weeks went on, more troubling signs began to emerge, small details, subtle interactions that most people might have missed, but were painfully obvious to someone like her. Officers avoiding certain neighborhoods, officers making casual remarks about residents' types, and worst of all, the growing feeling that some within the department were actively avoiding the very people they were supposed to protect. Ayanna had grown up in neighborhoods much like Elmwood Hills, though she'd long since moved beyond them. She knew what it was like to be judged based on where you lived or what you looked like, but seeing it play out in real time, within the walls of her own department, was something she wasn't prepared for. And what made it worse was that many of the officers she now worked with were people she had trusted, people who had once sworn an oath to uphold justice. It was late afternoon when Ayanna found herself in her office, the sun setting outside her window, casting long shadows across the precinct. She had been poring over case files for hours, scanning through reports of minor thefts and vandalism, trying to see the patterns. Her phone buzzed, and she picked it up without looking, her mind still focused on the paperwork. "Captain Taylor," came the voice of Officer Martinez, his tone tight with nervousness. "I need to talk to you. In person. It's important." Ayanna set the phone down and stood up quickly. Martinez wasn't the type to call unless something was wrong, and given the tension around the precinct, Ayanna suspected it had something to do with the growing unease she sensed among the staff. She walked quickly to the bullpen, scanning the faces of the officers gathered around. No one looked at her directly, and a few even seemed to pretend she wasn't there, their heads bent over their work, their conversations hushed. When she spotted Martinez near the back of the room, he waved her over, his face pale and tense. "Is everything okay, officer?" Ayanna asked, keeping her voice low, her eyes scanning the room to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. Martinez glanced around nervously before speaking. "It's Officer Russell." He paused, swallowing hard. I think he's involved in something. Something bad. Ayana's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression neutral. What do you mean, involved in something bad? Martinez hesitated again, his eyes darting to the other officers in the room. It's hard to explain, Captain. I've been hearing things, off the record, about him working with some of the business owners in town. Small-time deals, you know. People like him don't just get by without stepping over a line. Ayana's mind began to race, trying to piece together the fragments of information. She had already suspected Russell of harboring biases and using his authority to push his own agenda, but this was a different accusation. Working with criminals. Was he involved in something more than just the quiet prejudice she had witnessed? She needed to know more. Are you sure about this, Martinez? Ayana's voice was firm now, with just the right amount of urgency. I need you to be clear with me. If there's something going on, I need to know. No matter what. I don't have proof, Captain. But I've seen him meet with some of the business owners late at night, after hours. There's a lot of cash changing hands, and I know those people don't run legitimate businesses. Ayana took a deep breath, her mind already shifting into investigation mode. She had to tread carefully. This wasn't just a matter of bias anymore. This was a matter of corruption, and she couldn't let it slide. Not now, not after everything she had worked for. I'll handle it, Ayana said, her voice low but determined. But you need to stay quiet about this for now. Don't confront him. Don't talk to anyone else. We're going to handle this carefully. Martinez nodded, looking both relieved and terrified. Thank you, Captain. That night, Ayana drove through the quiet streets of Elmwood Hills, her mind working through the logistics of what she had just learned. It was late. Most of the shops had already closed, and the few streetlights scattered along the roads cast long shadows. As she drove past the small corner store that had been the center of several complaints from the community, she noticed a familiar figure standing outside the front door, talking to the owner. Officer Dave Russell. Ayana's breath caught in her throat. She could see the briefcase in Russell's hand, the way he spoke with the store owner in hushed tones. Everything about it screamed out of place. She slowed the car to a stop, parking a block away and turning off the engine. She needed to watch, needed to understand what was happening. For the next hour, Ayana sat in her car, her eyes trained on the store. She watched as Russell and the owner exchanged what appeared to be paperwork, some kind of transaction. Ayana had seen enough in her years to know that these weren't just regular business dealings. Something more was happening here, and it was too late to turn back. She made a mental note of the time and location, her mind already planning her next move. She would need to gather evidence, proof that would be irrefutable, something that couldn't be brushed aside. She couldn't trust the word of one officer. If she wanted to take Russell down, she had to be methodical, precise. No room for error. As Ayana drove back to the precinct, her phone buzzed with a text from Martinez. I think Russell suspects something. Be careful. It was a warning she would take seriously. She couldn't let herself be exposed, not yet. There were still too many loose threads, and she couldn't afford to act impulsively. Russell wasn't the only problem she needed to solve. The entire culture of the department needed to change, and Ayana knew it had to start with her. If she didn't lead with clarity and strength, all of this would crumble. The stakes had never been higher. The next morning, Ayana called an impromptu meeting with Lieutenant Harris and a few of the senior officers, including Officer Russell, under the guise of a routine briefing. The room was quieter than usual as everyone took their seats, the tension thick in the air. No one spoke, but all eyes were on Ayana as she stood at the front of the room. I've been going through some of the department's older cases, Ayana began, her voice cool and controlled, and I'd noticed some irregularities, some things we need to address as a team. She could see Russell stiffen at the mention of irregularities, his eyes darting briefly to the other officers, trying to gauge their reactions. Ayana continued, her gaze steady on Russell. This isn't just about the crimes we see on paper or the reports we file. It's about integrity. It's about doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. A few of the officers shifted uncomfortably, but Ayanna held her ground. I'll be conducting an audit of several ongoing investigations. We're going to ensure that everything is above board, and no one is skirting the system. She could feel Russell's eyes on her, his gaze icy and calculating. She knew that he was probably already trying to figure out how to manipulate the situation. But Ayanna was one step ahead of him. I expect full cooperation from everyone, she finished, her voice unwavering. Any attempts to obstruct this investigation will be dealt with accordingly. As the meeting ended, Ayanna watched as Russell and a few of the other officers left the room, their heads low, murmuring amongst themselves. She could feel the weight of their resentment pressing down on her. But in that moment, she didn't care. She had a job to do, and she was going to see it through, no matter the cost. The cracks began to show. The next few days were filled with tension as Ayanna navigated her way through a growing web of intrigue. Her meeting with Lieutenant Harris and Officer Russell had sent a clear message through the precinct. Ayanna Taylor wasn't going to tolerate any more complacency, and certainly not corruption. As she had suspected, her warning had created an unease among the officers, a ripple effect that was felt in every corner of the station. Some had begun to avoid eye contact with her, while others offered only curt nods, clearly not happy with her methods. But Ayanna remained undeterred. If anything, their discomfort was a sign she was on the right track. She had worked in tough precincts before, and while Elmwood Hills wasn't as volatile as some, its quiet surface hid currents of corruption, biases, and half-hidden secrets. She wasn't going to allow that to continue, not while she was in charge. That evening, after another long day of scrutinizing reports and tracking down leads, Ayanna made her way to the precinct's evidence room. She needed to follow up on Martinez's claim about Officer Russell's late-night meetings with business owners. While she still didn't have hard evidence, the pieces were starting to align, and she could feel the weight of the investigation beginning to pull at her. The pressure of doing this by the book, of taking every step cautiously, felt suffocating at times, but Ayanna wasn't one to rush things. As she stood in the dimly lit room, sorting through case files, her thoughts drifted back to the moment she had witnessed Russell meeting with the store owner. She had made a mental note of the time, and now it was time to confirm whether the meeting had any connection to the ongoing cases or whether Russell had indeed crossed a line. The precinct's records were neatly organized, but Ayanna knew there was one crucial file that might tie everything together. The local business owner's records. A few months back, a string of minor break-ins had occurred at stores that were largely located on the edge of Elmwood Hills. The burglaries were quickly dismissed by some of the older officers as isolated incidents, and no serious investigation had been conducted. It was the perfect opportunity for someone like Russell to exploit the situation, especially if these business owners were involved in anything illegal. Ayanna found the file she was looking for. As she flipped through the pages, her eyes scanned the list of owners who had reported property damage. Some names stood out, familiar faces that had been involved in minor incidents in the past. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the name Jonas Kendrick, the owner of the convenience store where she had seen Russell meet with him. Kendrick's record was sparse, but there were a few mentions of unreported transactions in the past. Perhaps they were dismissed as accounting mistakes, or perhaps they had been overlooked. She pulled out Kendrick's file, flipping through the paperwork. Her fingers paused over a specific entry, a series of large cash deposits made to Kendrick's business under a different name. The amounts were irregular, deposited after hours, and the source of the funds was untraceable. Ayanna's instincts flared. This was more than a few petty transactions. It could be something much bigger. The next morning, Ayanna called in Martinez for a private conversation. He had been looking over his shoulder since his warning, but Ayanna wanted to reassure him that they were moving forward. "Martinez," Ayanna greeted as he stepped into her office. His eyes were still a little wide with nerves, but there was a flicker of determination in them too. "You were right to come forward. I need your help with something, but this has to stay between us. Martinez nodded, eager to prove his loyalty. Anything, Captain. What do you need? I need you to start shadowing Officer Russell. I know it's risky, but I believe he's been meeting with certain individuals under the guise of business transactions, and I need to know who those people are, where he's meeting them, and what's really going on. Martinez's eyes widened with concern. Captain, you're asking me to follow him. If Russell finds out. I know. Ayanna interrupted, her voice calm but firm. It's a risk. But right now, you're the only one I can trust. If we can get solid proof, we can take action. Otherwise, this will just stay another rumor. Martinez hesitated, but after a moment he nodded. I'm with you, Captain. I'll keep my eyes open. Just tell me where to start. Ayanna handed him a folder. I've pulled Kendrick's file. I want you to visit the store tomorrow. See if you can spot anything unusual, anything that could connect Kendrick to Russell or anyone else involved. And if you see Russell there, follow him quietly. Get what you can. Martinez hesitated again. Captain, are you sure about this? If this goes public, Russell could make it look like we're making accusations without proof. Unsure, Ayanna said, her voice hardening. I don't do things halfway, Martinez. We need to get this right. If Russell is as deep in this as I think, we can't just let him keep operating unchecked. Martinez seemed to accept her decision, nodding silently before leaving the office. As the door closed behind him, Ayanna leaned back in her chair, her mind working through the complexities of what they were about to do. That afternoon, Ayanna received an unexpected visitor. The door to her office opened slowly, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Officer Russell. For a moment, the tension in the room seemed to freeze. Russell stood there, his uniform crisp as always, but there was something different in his posture. He was trying to project calm, but Ayanna could see the tightness in his jaw. He wasn't here to talk about police business. Captain, Russell greeted her, his voice cool and formal. I just wanted to check in with you. I know there's been some tension around here lately. Ayanna studied him carefully, noting the faint hint of a smile on his lips, as if he were trying to appear casual. It was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, one that felt more like a calculated move than a friendly gesture. I've noticed that too, Ayanna replied, keeping her tone professional, but her eyes never leaving his. But I'm sure you understand. It's my job to ensure everything here is operating above board. Russell's smile faltered for a second, and for a split second, Ayanna could see the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. He quickly masked it, but not before Ayanna caught it. She had struck a nerve. Of course, he replied quickly, a little too quickly. I just wanted to remind you, Captain, that things in this town work a certain way. You don't want to upset the balance too much. People here appreciate stability. Stability, Ayanna repeated thoughtfully, her gaze never leaving his. That's one way to put it. But when stability is built on complacency and corruption, it's not something I'm willing to preserve. Not at any cost. Russell's expression hardened, the polite smile completely gone now. He took a slow step toward the door, his eyes locking with hers. You're new here, Captain. Don't forget that. With that, he turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him with a finality that sent a cold shiver down Ayanna's spine. She sat back in her chair, her heart beating faster now. This was no longer just about minor infractions. Russell knew she was closing in on him, and he wasn't going to let her take him down without a fight. But Ayanna was no stranger to resistance. She had learned long ago that every fight, no matter how difficult, could be won with the right strategy. She wasn't afraid of him, or his threats. She just had to outsmart him. And she was getting closer by the day. The shifting balance. The tension in the precinct was palpable now, a silent but ever-present weight in the air. Officer Russell had clearly noticed the shift in Ayanna's approach, and though he had tried to mask it with his usual charm and quiet intimidation, there was no mistaking the subtle changes in his behavior. The more Ayanna dug, the more she realized the depths of the corruption that had taken root here in Elmwood Hills, and the more dangerous it became to confront it head-on. The following week was a blur of careful observation, quiet interrogations, and tracking down every lead Ayanna could find. The subtle yet persistent feeling that she was being watched grew stronger with each passing day. Officer Russell's actions seemed more guarded now, as though he was expecting someone to catch on to what he had been doing behind the scenes. Ayanna could sense that he was starting to feel cornered. She had enlisted Martinez's help to keep a close eye on Kendrick's convenience store, where Russell had been seen meeting with the owner. Martinez was doing his best to follow without drawing attention, though Ayanna knew the risk he was taking. If Russell suspected anything, it could all come crashing down. They needed solid evidence, something undeniable, something that would not only expose Russell, but also send a clear message to the rest of the department that things were changing. Ayanna sat in her office late one evening, the harsh fluorescent lights above casting a sterile glow over her desk. She had just finished reviewing a stack of new case files when her phone buzzed, the sudden noise breaking the stillness of the room. It was a text from Martinez. "Russell left Kendrick's place late last night. I followed him. He made a stop at a warehouse on the edge of town. It's a dead-end road. Something's off. Need your help." Ayanna's heart skipped a beat. This was it. They finally had something concrete. If Russell was meeting Kendrick late at night and heading to a secluded location afterward, there was no way it could be innocent. But they needed to act quickly. She couldn't afford to waste time waiting for more pieces to fall into place. The risk was high, but Ayanna knew that hesitation could be their undoing. She grabbed her jacket and headed for the door. As she walked through the precinct, she passed a few officers who were still finishing their shifts. Their eyes flicked toward her, but no one spoke. There was an unspoken understanding now. Ayanna was no longer just the new captain. She was a force to be reckoned with, and the officers who had once walked the line of complacency were now beginning to feel the heat of her investigation. The warehouse was tucked away at the far end of Elmwood Hills, near the industrial district, a place Ayanna had only heard about in passing. It was the kind of location that didn't attract attention. Isolated, surrounded by old shipping containers and rusted fences, the perfect place to hide illicit activity. As Ayanna's car rumbled down the quiet, empty road, she spotted Martinez's vehicle parked in the shadows, just a few yards away from the entrance of the warehouse. Ayanna parked behind him, careful not to draw attention. She could hear her pulse thumping in her ears, a combination of adrenaline and the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This could be the turning point of everything, but if they weren't careful, it could also be their downfall. Martinez was already waiting for her, crouched behind a pile of crates near the warehouse entrance. His face was pale, eyes wide with anxiety. "Captain, you have to see this." She crouched beside him, keeping her voice low. "What's going on?" Martinez pointed toward the entrance of the warehouse. "I followed Russell here, but it's not just him. There's a group of men inside. They're unloading boxes, all covered up. I couldn't get close enough to see exactly what's inside, but it's not legal. I know that much." Ayanna squinted into the shadows of the warehouse. She could barely make out the figures moving in and out of the building, their silhouettes stark against the dim light coming from inside. There was an energy about the place that felt wrong, something that didn't belong in Elmwood Hills. "Do you have a clear shot?" Ayanna asked. Martinez nodded. "I've got a camera set up. If we get closer, I can get the footage. But we can't make a move yet. Russell's still inside." Ayanna thought for a moment. "We can't just sit here. We need to get eyes on what they're unloading. If Russell's involved in something illegal, we need the proof to take him down." The two of them crept closer, careful not to make any noise. Ayanna's heart raced, her senses on high alert. They were so close now, so close to finally unmasking Russell's secret dealings. The evidence they needed was just out of reach. But they couldn't get caught. As they reached a vantage point near the edge of the warehouse, Ayanna held her breath. The shadows inside the building shifted as the men moved large crates into the back of an unmarked van. She could see the shape of the boxes now. Large, heavy, and covered with tarps. There was no mistaking it. These weren't ordinary supplies. These were goods that were being moved in the dead of night, away from prying eyes. Suddenly, one of the men turned toward the door, his flashlight beam scanning the area. Ayanna and Martinez ducked behind the crates just in time, holding their breath as the man's footsteps grew closer. The tension was suffocating. Every fiber of Ayanna's being was focused on the man's movements, praying he wouldn't see them. The seconds felt like hours as the man walked past them, his flashlight missing them by mere inches. When the coast was clear, Ayanna signaled to Martinez to move. He pulled out his phone and quickly activated the camera. They recorded the men unloading the crates, making sure to capture every detail. As the footage rolled, Ayanna's mind raced. If they could link the goods to Russell, it would be the proof they needed to bring him down. Just as they were about to retreat, a noise came from the back of the warehouse. The door slammed open, and Officer Russell stepped out, his face hard and unreadable. He was carrying a briefcase, the same one Ayanna had seen him with days before. She froze. This was it. Russell was involved in something far bigger than anyone had imagined. And now, they had the evidence. But just as they began to retreat, Martinez's foot caught on a pile of loose debris, sending a loud crash through the quiet night. Russell's head whipped around. His sharp eyes scanned the shadows, pausing just long enough for Ayanna and Martinez to know they were discovered. "Run," Ayanna hissed, her heart pounding in her chest. They didn't hesitate. They turned and bolted, the sound of footsteps echoing behind them as they sprinted toward the car. Ayanna's mind was racing with the possibilities, but there was no time to think, no time to second-guess the plan. All that mattered now was getting out safely, getting the footage, and preparing for the inevitable showdown that would follow. By the time they reached the safety of Ayanna's car, both of them were out of breath, adrenaline coursing through their veins. Ayanna slammed the door shut and locked it. She looked over at Martinez, whose face was pale but determined. "You got the footage?" she asked, her voice calm but urgent. Martinez nodded, pulling out his phone and showing her the recording. The men, the crates, the van. It was all there, clear as day. "This is it," Ayanna murmured. "We've got him." But deep down, Ayanna knew this was only the beginning. The real fight was just starting. With this footage, they could expose Russell, but it wouldn't be easy. There were powerful forces at play, and she would need all the support she could get to take them down. As Ayanna drove back to the precinct, she felt the weight of the moment settling in. The stakes had never been higher, and the road ahead was uncertain. But there was no turning back now. This was her fight, her battle to bring justice to a community that had been manipulated for too long. And she wasn't going to lose. Not now. Not ever. The tipping point. The following days in Elmwood Hills were marked by an eerie sense of anticipation. The discovery of the footage, evidence that Officer Russell had been involved in something far beyond the simple corruption Ayanna had expected, had set off a chain of events that was already snowballing. The quiet town she had thought she was sent to reform had a far darker undercurrent than she'd anticipated, and with every passing moment, the stakes only seemed to rise higher. Ayanna had gone over the footage from the warehouse repeatedly, scrutinizing the men unloading crates and Russell's involvement in the operation. It wasn't just a matter of illegal goods being moved. It was clear now that the operation was part of a much larger criminal network, one that had seeped into the town's infrastructure. The complexity of it was overwhelming. There was no telling just how far the rot went, or how many people were involved. But what haunted Ayanna the most wasn't the threat of the criminals or the possible connections she had yet to uncover. It was the fact that she had allowed herself to believe in the illusion of control. She had trusted too easily in the system. This precinct, this community, was more broken than she had imagined. Elmwood Hills wasn't just a place of complacency. It was a place of deep, systemic corruption. Her phone buzzed on the desk as she leaned over the evidence once again. It was a message from Martinez. "Russell's making his rounds. He's talking to someone at the precinct, probably getting his story straight. We need to act fast." The urgency in Martinez's message sent a jolt through Ayanna. Russell was clearly preparing for something, and Ayanna was no longer willing to wait for the perfect moment. It was time to act. That afternoon, Ayanna gathered a small team of officers she trusted, those who had already shown their loyalty to her cause. Martinez, of course, was part of it. He had proven himself in ways Ayanna hadn't expected, and she had come to rely on his instincts. Officer Harris, Lieutenant Harris, was there as well. Despite his initial reservations, Ayanna had slowly earned his trust, and she needed him to help lead the charge once they moved on Russell. The rest of the team was composed of newer officers, people who weren't yet tainted by the culture that had set in at the precinct. Ayanna couldn't afford to have anyone with ties to the old way of doing things. She needed a clean slate. The precinct buzzed with activity as Ayanna and her team prepared for the raid. There was a quiet hum of tension in the air, a sense of unease that seemed to hang over everyone. Ayanna had always prided herself on being prepared, on thinking several steps ahead. But this time, it was different. This wasn't just about bringing down one corrupt officer. It was about dismantling the deeply rooted system that had operated with impunity for far too long. She could feel the weight of that responsibility settling into her bones. Martinez had already started tracking Russell's movements through the precinct, carefully watching him as he moved through the building. Russell was being unusually careful, moving through hallways with a sense of urgency. He was preparing for something. Ayanna could sense it, but whether it was an escape or a counterattack, she couldn't be sure. She didn't have the luxury of time. They had to move now, or they could lose everything. The raid itself was fast-paced and methodical. Ayanna and her team stormed the back entrance of the warehouse first, using the element of surprise to catch Russell's associates off guard. The men inside were expecting trouble, but not this kind of trouble. It took mere minutes to overwhelm them. And within moments, the warehouse was swarming with officers, cutting off every exit. Ayanna moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the dark corners of the building as she and her team systematically cleared the area. Every step was deliberate, and yet Ayanna could feel the pressure mounting with every second. Russell had to be here. He couldn't have known they were coming, but he had to be here. When Ayanna and Martinez reached the far end of the warehouse, she saw it. Russell, standing near the stacks of crates, his face a mixture of defiance and panic as he reached for his phone. He looked up just as Ayanna's team closed in on him. "Don't move, Russell," Ayanna commanded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. "We have you now." For a moment, Russell froze. His eyes flicked from Ayanna to the officers around him, his mind racing as he realized his escape route had been cut off. He dropped the phone to the floor, a hollow look on his face as he raised his hands in surrender. "Captain, you don't know what you're getting into," Russell said, his voice low, a calculated coldness in his tone. "You think this is just about me. It's bigger than you could ever imagine." Ayanna stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "I don't care how big it is, Russell. It's over now. You've been running this town for too long, and it ends today." Russell sneered, but Ayanna saw the fear lurking behind his bravado. He had underestimated her, just like everyone else who had thought they could intimidate her into submission. As the officers moved in to secure the area and arrest the men, Ayanna felt a sense of triumph, but it was hollow. The operation had been a success, but the war was far from over. Russell might have been caught, but there were others still operating in the shadows. Ayanna had just pulled back the curtain, and the extent of the corruption was more vast and pervasive than she had anticipated. She knew Russell wasn't the ringleader. He was just a cog in a much larger machine. Back at the precinct, as Ayanna watched Russell being processed in the holding cells, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was yet to come. The officers who had been complacent, who had turned a blind eye to the things happening in their community, weren't going to go down easily. Ayanna had made a powerful enemy, and Russell was only the beginning. He knew too much. He was too connected. In the days that followed, Ayanna found herself facing pressure from all sides. Some of the older officers, those who had been complicit in Russell's activities or who had turned a blind eye to his actions, began to murmur in the halls, questioning her leadership and calling into doubt her methods. The whispers grew louder with every passing hour. Some of them didn't take kindly to the way she was shaking up the department, especially now that Russell's arrest had become the talk of the precinct. But Ayanna was undeterred. She had expected the resistance. She had expected the pushback. The truth was, she had been prepared for this moment long before she'd walked through the doors of Elmwood Hills. The precinct was divided, and it always had been. There were those who valued the status quo, who wanted to keep things the way they were. And there were those, like Ayanna, who were ready to dismantle the old guard and rebuild. Ayanna knew the next step would be critical. Russell's arrest had rocked the system, but it had also left a vacuum. In the days ahead, she would have to move swiftly, building alliances, gaining the trust of the officers who were still on the fence, and ensuring that the evidence they had collected could lead them to the heart of the criminal network. If she could expose the full extent of the corruption, then maybe, just maybe, she could begin to heal this broken town. Late one night, as Ayanna sat alone in her office, her phone buzzed once again. It was a message from Martinez. The higher-ups are already talking. Someone in the department knows. We're not done yet. Ayanna's fingers hovered over the screen as she read the message. Her heart skipped a beat. Someone knew about the investigation. Someone higher up had gotten wind of it. And if they were involved, the fight was about to get even harder.